I am concerned because I think my fear is that we might go straight from crazy neoconservatism, John Bolton style, past what I'm talking about to like screw the world. Let's just focus up at home. And I don't think that's going to be good for us as a country, politically, intellectually, etc.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Nate, Johnny, and Marlo.
Today, our guest is Elbridge Colby, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development at the Department of Defense, and author of the new book, The Strategy of Denial, American Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict. We have a lot to talk about with Elbridge today, given Russia's invasion of Ukraine, so we're glad he could take the time to join us to talk about foreign policy. Thanks for being here, Elbridge.
Great. Good to be with you guys.
Before we continue with our interview, I'd like to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, where our mission at ISI is to educate for liberty. If you would like to help us in this mission, please rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts to help us reach more listeners like yourself. So, Elbridge, given your experience in working in the foreign policy ecosystem, could you start by telling us just a little bit about what you did at the Department of Defense and what your top concerns or interests were in foreign policy during this time period and today?
Sure. Well, thanks, and really good to be on with ISI. I remember actually really benefiting from ISI in a lot of ways when I was in college and afterwards, I think in law school as well. So a really important effort at giving some support and I guess the term now is space to conservative leaning students in a world in which it obviously no longer can be taken for granted. I remember being in college and I thought the left was ascendant then, but now I think it was pretty. Bill Clinton looks like he looks like Ronald Reagan compared to what we're seeing today. So. A really important effort, and I in the Pentagon. I've served in the government a few stints, but most recently when I was there in 2017, 2018 under the Trump administration, I was the lead official in the development of the 2018 National Defense Strategy, which is the primary Defense Department overarching kind of strategic document. And our real effort was to try to refocus the department and the military on great power competition, particularly China above all, in getting the military back focused on being able to win the nation's major wars in order to deter them after many, many years of focusing on counterterrorism, counterinsurgency stuff in the Middle East, fighting kind of smaller states like Iraq and North Korea and so forth are being prepared to do so. And so that was our main effort. And, I think at least in the document, we made a lot of progress, I think, although the implementation has not been as sort of comprehensive as certainly I would have hoped, but that's reality.
So, Elbridge, I think we want to get into obviously all of the really topical issues surrounding Ukraine. But before we do, one thing that you've written a little bit about, we're a podcast that's obviously interested in a lot of the internecine debates within conservatism about the future of the right, and what the last 5 years really, but particularly the last few months have exposed is these fault lines in the conservative movement in terms of one's view of foreign policy. Could you talk a little bit about sort of just give us a sense of the landscape of the different factions of conservative thought right now on foreign policy? And then we'd love to hear just where you stand and why.
Oh, I think this is a really important issue and one where there's a lot of flux. How would I characterize it? I mean, for many years, well, let me start out this way. Look, what is conservatism to me? I mean, I think conservatism is basically a kind of a disposition more than a particular set of ideological principles. It's compatible with a number of different approaches, specific approaches or religions or views. But, in essence, it's basically the idea is that, you're primarily responsible for those, your family, your country, those are immediately around you to whom you're directly tied. It tends to sort of say, it doesn't have to have what Michael Kinsley mocked as a conservative's treasured sense of futility. It doesn't mean you can't do anything, but you're suspicious of grand projects that seek to transform the world or fundamentally, undermine human or kind of go in the face of human nature, which is obviously happening in spades right now. And I think is realistic about the world. I mean, in the sense that, the sort of James Madison's comment that if we were all angels, we wouldn't need government, right? That, it doesn't mean that you think that everybody's, a demon, but it's sort of, the idea that, it's a tough world out there and it's competitive and people can be quite nasty and you got to account for that. So those are, to me, that's sort of naturally the natural conservative, and that like self-interest is sort of a part of human nature. It's not necessarily lauded, but has to be accounted for. In light of that's the disposition also that I kind of take towards foreign policy. In light of that, the last generation, so someone my age, you guys are younger than I am, and your listeners are as well, is very strange because, I came of age politically in the 1990s, and then I lived through the Bush administration. And that was a very bizarre time because, in a sense, the quote unquote conservative foreign policy was actually not conservative in any way that I've just described. And it was almost its antithesis. It was actually aggressively liberal, or actually not liberal, progressive, I would say. I mean, liberal has some objective content, which is, if you go back to Lord Acton or John Stuart Mill, right? It's like respect for free speech, these kinds of things. It's not necessarily what we're seeing these days. But, the ascendancy of what's often called the neoconservatives. Now, different people are characterized neoconservative, but in the colloquial sense, neoconservatism was defined by essentially subscription to the progressive aims, the sort of end of history aims, but just was more violent about it. That's kind of the main distinction, which is very strange because I was always out of sorts with this. I remember I actually served in Iraq as a civilian. I mean, not with any distinction, but I was there, and I was there in the early stages, and this was under a Republican administration, and it was like they were going to transform the whole country. They were going to turn it all into like, Brooklyn or whatever, pick your, Santa Monica, I don't know, whatever, Dallas. And that was just very strange to me because I'd gone to college I graduated in 2002 and, I was a conservative. I wrote for the conservative newspaper at Harvard. And, so I was like, wait a minute, this is something different. So this is the still, especially in the older and more the senior ranks of the quote unquote, at this point, traditional Republican Party. It's not really traditional. It's the quote unquote establishment. I hate that term, but basically the people who still, kind of harken back to that era, that's still the dominant mindset, which again, I find very strange. Now, my point of view, I think there's if you have the neoconservatives who are kind of like, you got to project a dominant form of essentially progressivism, usually throughout the world. And we have to use force to do so if necessary, and is only distinguished from like Tony Blinken often by the fact that it's just more prepared to use military force, which, by the way, I don't think is conservative. I mean, Lenin and Trotsky were much more violent than like Disraeli or, pick your, I don't know, Lord Salisbury, or Abraham Lincoln, or pick your conservative, whatever.
Or Edmund Burke.
Or Edmund Burke, for that matter. Yeah, exactly. Edmund Burke, exactly. And so that's one school. Then there's a, if we're being simplistic, I would say the other extreme of the conservative disposition, which harkens back to much earlier in our history, is this sort of, people call it isolationist. I think that's a bit reductive. I don't like to use the term isolationist because I think it's usually used as a sort of an attack term. But that's basically the idea that, war is the health of the state. It's usually, we want a smaller government. Most of the problems abroad we can safely ignore. We're behind two oceans. It's better than getting in a massive war. And especially over the last 20 years, I think this point of view has landed some fair critiques. I tend to sympathize with a good number of the critiques of the ascendant, extremely hubristic, neoconservative dominant strain. But I also disagree with that because I think if we go back to my description of conservatism, I think it's, it's a tough world out there. Like, I mean, do we get rid of the police? Like, no. I mean, you got to have I'm always like curious the reaction I'm going to get these days, because like 15 years ago, I use this analogy, nobody would care, but now it's like this controversial thing. To me, the military and our geopolitical interests are like police in a neighborhood. Like, you want it to be safe, then you can worry about your home and your school and investing in a business, but not until then. Of course, lots of people are saying defund the police these days. So but not conservatives, right? Like, so anyway, so that's and we can get into that if you want, the kind of my critique of, and some people with whom I agree on a number of issues, like the guys who wrote the New York Times piece. I disagree with them on a lot of things, but I also agree with them on some things, about the country's moral decay. This is something that really concerns me. But I don't think the logical deduction from, hey, we're having trouble at home is like nothing else matters. I just don't think that's rational. So I think my view is consistent with this kind of conservative disposition, which is, okay, it's not our job to get, and I actually think it's kind of a middle way. It's not our job to go in search of monsters to destroy. It's not our job to be the world's policeman. As John Quincy Adams said 200 years ago, we're the well-wishers of liberty everywhere, but we're not its guarantors or something, words to that effect. But the world is a competitive and tough place, and people are going to look to get ahead and get their own interests. And if they're going to, as Putin is demonstrating, if it means the use of force, if they think they can get away with it, they will, or at least the most ruthless will. And that's what matters, because if you allow the most ruthless to get ahead, then you'll live in a world that's very ruthless. And so what I'm trying to do, in a number of ways, and with my book, The Strategy of Denial, is kind of it's certainly not only relevant to conservatives, but I think it's especially relevant to fellow conservatives, because it's sort of like, all right, well, how do we think about the world in this context? And I look at it through this kind of, I would say, kind of classically realist, and to me, realism and conservatism are sort of linked. They don't necessarily need to go together. I mean, a lot of academic realists are not conservatives, but they jive, right? Because it's basically saying, look, the world is a pretty tough place, and you got to look after yourself. And you can spout morality like Tony Blinken or Joe Biden, but at the end of the day, you got to deliver. These are kind of the basic ideas, and that's sort of what I'm trying to do. And I think, one of the reasons I was so keen to talk to you guys is I think my sense is that the younger generation, and talking to people like Sagar and Marshall Kosloff and others, that this is the sense I get, that actually the younger generation and people out in the country outside of the blob, outside of the Beltway, are much more simpatico, I think, much more sympathetic to the kind of arguments that I'm making. I'm kind of a lone voice for this stuff in Washington, which I just continue to be so shocked by it, because what I'm saying seems to me to be pretty like banal. I don't know. Like, it seems like, I don't know. We should probably not be getting in multiple new wars if we can avoid it. We should get the Europeans to do more. China's a big problem, but but yet apparently John Bolton decides to attack me in the Wall Street Journal, which is a signal that I'm definitely right, since he's been wrong about literally everything possible. but that's sort of, but I, talking to you guys, I think, but I'm also a bit concerned. More than a bit concerned. I am concerned, because I think my fear is that we might go straight from crazy neoconservatism, John Bolton style, past what I'm talking about to screw the world. Let's just focus up at home. And I don't think that's going to be good for us as a country, politically, intellectually, et cetera.
So to that point, I've also been struck before at how much the modern neoconservative foreign policy project is a departure from what I traditionally understood conservatism to be. If you read George W. Bush's speeches, particularly during his second term about Iraq, it really is shockingly progressive. It's this sort of Hegelian language of liberty being the end of history, and every person having a right to. It sounds a lot more like Woodrow Wilson than it does like any sort of traditional conservative thinker. So I really do think conservative movement lost itself for a moment in terms of foreign policy. In the context of what's going on in Ukraine right now, you see a lot of finger pointing and noise, right? So there's, on the one hand, there's the argument that this is the sort of downfall of the neoconservative project with NATO expansionism and sort of nation building and trying to sort of project American power on everywhere, even in places where it doesn't make sense for it to exist. And then on the other side, you hear sort of the more hawkish end of the spectrum saying that this is the fault of the isolationists or the realists or the people who counseled restraint.
They haven't had any power, so how can they be involved? Right.
Well, that was my question, right? It's like it sounds like you already have strong opinions on this debate, which I'm not surprised about. But what do you make of those sort of questions about Ukraine?
Okay, well, first, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, I just remember being like sitting there in Iraq, and I mean, I was only there a few months, but like under the Bush administration, I was like, am I on drugs? Like, this is. Bill Clinton was a conservative comparatively because at least he was sort of prudent. He was sort of like always triangulating. So it was like he was at least tactically prudent, which certainly did not define the George W. Bush's approach, right? And I mean, that's a really interesting issue. And I mean, at a personal level, I think what happened, a lot of it is that there was obviously this sort of fusion at the end of the Cold War. Well, I mean, it started with the whole Buckley thing, but like, you had, I guess the conventional narrative is you had the social conservative, the moral majority and that type. And then you had the business people, kind of cut taxes, the Milton Friedman types. And then you had the sort of national security types. And then within national security, you had the sort of liberal hawk kind of types like, and then the sort of more prudent realist type, and realism has never been deeply rooted as like a conscious idea in American political, but I mean, the disposition of like, obviously a Nixon, but also like an Eisenhower, it's very, that kind of thing, that group. But then after the Cold War, I think we just got arrogant, we just got hubris and, you can see it. And people said, why, in a sense, it's a vindication of realism and conservatism, which is like, don't let anybody get too much power because they're bound to do something at minimum stupid and at maximum really bad. And at minimum, we did some really stupid things. I mean, we invaded Iraq and it was a catastrophe. We expanded the mission in Afghanistan. We let China, grow without holding them accountable and changing their economy to adapt as they grew incredibly powerful. We collapsed our financial system. We allowed deindustrialization. So it's like, I think we're going to look back at that period and look at it as a catastrophe. I mean, these were preventable catastrophes. China was going to rise and so forth, and we couldn't, you couldn't practically stop 9/11, or maybe if not 9/11, Al Qaeda from trying to get at us, but we could have avoided a lot of these things. So anyway, that's sort of, so it's in a sense, it's staggering that this attitude is still so powerful in the Republican Party because it's so detached from reality. And now we're even farther down that path. We spent 20 years in Afghanistan and it completely collapsed. And that's what we had to sort of show for at the end of the day. China has risen and is like really here and is an immense, like sort of civilizational level challenge because of its size. And then the Ukraine thing's coming on. I mean, whose fault it is, I don't know. I mean, I'm sort of more like, there's plenty of blame to go around probably. And I mean, starting with Vladimir Putin, of course, but my sense here is, and again, this is kind of a, I don't think that, certainly I don't agree with the sort of liberal imperialist kind of approach, which is like bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO right now. I mean, I've said that that's a bad idea. NATO should be a security alliance that's designed to defend itself and basically solve our collective problems, security problems. On the other hand, I don't like buy in or think that we would be best served. And again, I'm thinking about it like I think about it from, in my view, a sort of a conservative point of view, which is like, what's in the interest of the American people? And it's like maybe Vladimir Putin has some complaints. Well, that's his problem. Like we need to reckon with them as a political reality. But it's like it shouldn't be as thinking about American strategy. It's not my job to be like, well, what's fair to Vladimir Putin? That's not what I'm concerned about. Other than instrumentally, basically. What I'm concerned about is what's best for the American people. And what's best for the American people is that we avoid a major war with the Russians while, certainly denying Russia or anybody else a dominant position over Europe and, really a descent into chaos or larger conflict within Europe, these kinds of things. And so that's where I think we can do that right now. And my view is we can combine that, and this is while prioritizing Asia. This is a combination of making it clear and direct to Putin and the Kremlin that they are not going to benefit from this aggression. They're not going to be able to quickly ingest Ukraine and then kind of reset and move onward, that they're going to suffer and it's going to be difficult for them to do that. Support the Ukrainians with weapons and other things that as much as we can, and then get the Europeans to step up, which again is like a classic. The neocons love to talk about like how America can do everything, and it's like, wait a minute, how's that in Americans' interest? We're all spending over 3% of our income every year, and like I get why people in the Beltway benefit, because people abroad treat you very important. If you're an American expert, people really like, ooh, the Americans, right? And no, it's great. It's great for vanity. But like, is that our job? Isn't our job to be what's in the American people's interest? And the American people's interest is like, those Germans need to start spending a lot more money yesterday. And if somebody's not being nice to the Germans, they're not looking after the American people's interest. They're looking after their interest in their relationship with Germany. And that I think is, I think it's unconscionable actually. But what the Germans are doing is unconscionable. But anyway, that's I think. But I think that and my partner and good friend Wes Mitchell, I think, is very good on this point. That actually there's a conservative mindset also, which says you find yourself in a situation. Our point here is our purpose here should not be to prove an intellectual or theoretical point, to say that the realists were always right. We overdid it with NATO. That's not the point here. The point here is to do what's best for the American people over the longer term, and that involves some kind of equilibrium where we hold the NATO line and so forth. But also kind of are able to put the Russians in a box, if you will.
Elbridge, I'm curious, kind of both with this specific situation and zooming out a bit. You see the kind of there's a little bit of a whiplash, not only among conservatives, but in the media generally. So if you watch Fox News in the morning, for example,
it's fascinating, right? Across the day, it's amazing.
Yeah, it's as hawkish as can be, right? All the old, retired generals who led us to disaster in Iraq and Afghanistan are brought back. And then in the evening, it's like, totally different world. And so, you've talked about kind of avoiding both of these extremes. Now we have the context where it does seem like this unipolar kind of moment is unraveling. There's kind of a resetting, maybe, breaking into spheres of influence. I'm just curious, like the world, according to Elbridge Colby, like if you were calling the shots, what does the application of American power look like throughout the world, specifically post whatever Putin does in Ukraine? Let's say he puts in his puppet regime. What does your world look like if you're?
Well, I have a book for you on that topic. It's called "The Strategy of Denial: American Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict," which goes in. You guys, your listeners are in college or graduate school, so presumably they have some time. Hopefully, it's on their syllabi anyway. But I go into it in great length in that. I mean, look, I think basically, China's the biggest threat, and China's dominance of Asia is the thing we want to avoid, because that alone would allow them to agglomerate more than half of global GDP. And even the New York Times is admitting that now, that this is going to impose a real, more than a burden, like a fundamental threat to our liberty, not to mention our prosperity, because they're going to have, everybody's works for somebody, right? They're going to have the ability to lock us down. They've already shown that they will. So that's got to be our interest. So our priority, and in military terms, but also in economic or political capital, how we use sanctions, they need to be oriented around denying China the ability to establish hegemony over Asia. And the key point right now is Taiwan. We need to be able to defend Taiwan, not for its own sake, but for our sake, in a way that isn't too costly and risky, because then it would exceed our rational pain threshold. We do have interest in other theaters, but they are secondary. So we need to act as if they are secondary. So Europe is the second theater. It's a declining fraction of global GDP. And by the way, Russia is a fraction of China's power, and the other European states to which we're allied are much more powerful than Russia in aggregate. So they could actually, if they wanted to, if they got off their duffs, like Germany had during the Cold War, they could actually do a lot of that. So that's what we need to do. So my solution is not to abandon Europe. this is this canard that like the Boltons of the world will toss at someone like me. It's like, no, I'm not saying we abandon it. I'm saying we have a different approach. We have like and then similarly in the Middle East, you build on things like the Abraham Accords. We shouldn't get in these dumb wars like Iraq and waste our power and people's goodwill on these conflicts. But we shouldn't just skedaddle. But there are ways we can do that. We can support the Israelis, the Saudis, the Emirates, others that don't want to live under the Iranian thumb. Okay, good. Yeah. And then in South Asia, we got to have Afghanistan in a catastrophic way, which we had a right to expect better. But I think it was the right decision. Oh, back India, and then and that's basically, to me, that's like, okay, well, we've got limited resources in the context of the problems we face. It's not rational. It's so interesting. One of the things I said after that is like, don't listen to the rhetoric that people use. Look at what the costs are going to be and who's bearing them. So when people are like, we need to stand up everywhere, it's like, are they credibly calling for ways that the American people are going to double or triple the defense budget? Because if they're not, then they're just flapping their gums. That's not like what's really going on. And I just, it's funny you mentioned about Fox News. It's so interesting to watch. I mean, I equate, so, I have friends on the other side of the aisle, and I went to school with a lot of them and so forth. And I equate, particularly the Biden administration, is like Mandarin systems in 19th century China. It's like the late stage decay of this kind of intellectual system, but it's extremely hierarchical, and they all are very deferential. So it's like from a sociological point of view, it's very conservative. It's very traditional, and they're very incremental. And you can see that in, I think, the way their policy works. It's very lowest common denominator, very gradual, Meanwhile, the conservative side is, I equate the conservative foreign policy debate, and I think it's true on the domestic side as well, is more like Tombstone. Like there's, roving bands of cowboys running around, like having shootouts with each other. But it's a really interesting time to be a conservative in the foreign policy field, but also in places like economic policy, where people like, Orrin Cass and Julius Krein, American Compass, they're breaking orthodoxy. Do I agree with them on everything? Probably no, but like, that's not the point, right? We're a coalition, and people are going to make arguments that maybe in 5 years, they're going to say, that wasn't quite right. But it's a much more plastic and dynamic intellectual political environment. And again, I think the more input we can have from younger generation, the better, because it's the brain deads, who are like fixated on 1999 and the sort of neoconservative ascendancy, doing real damage. And Fox is fascinating to watch. And even during the day, you see different, and you see even people who are like I won't name it, but like some of the afternoon, I've noticed, because I've been watching a lot of TV recently with all the Ukraine stuff, some of the hosts will like test out something, is that going to make sense? Like, do we really need to do that after the 20 years in the Middle East? And you're like, wow, I would not have heard that on Fox 10 years ago. And then, of course, in the evening, you've got Tucker, Hannity, Ingram, but then you've got like the more traditional, quote unquote, establishment types during the day. But I think what we're seeing is, and I was talking to a reporter about this yesterday, what you're seeing across the day is that debate. And, I was going to put something on this on Twitter, like Jack Keane. Okay, Jack Keane, former vice chief of staff of the Army, big voice for the kind of traditional approach. But I was watching Jack Keane about the Ukraine thing, and he's like, these guys are really serious. And he's like, we don't have a military that can fight them and the Chinese at the same time. And it's like, well, that's some truth right there. That's some reality. This is somebody who understands the reality. Then you can have a conversation about what to do. But anyway, yeah. I think it's an interesting time. But I really hope. I think what I'm saying is the natural equilibrium for the conservative movement to orient around. But we'll see.
On the note of the neoconservative ascendancy that you mentioned previously, I'm curious what you think about. I've definitely sensed a lot of people feel disaffected, and this is just my observation of the general public, and also of people who are more critical of U.S. intervention abroad, whether that's Iran, in Russia and Ukraine, where have you. How do you think the excesses of the post 9/11 period have influenced how conservatives approach foreign policy today? Because even I've seen some dovishness on the China side as well, even though there are criticisms in other spheres of, of China's, general hegemony, or how there is clearly this, we recognize that it's a threat, but it does seem like there's this absolutism that has pervaded in a sense. I don't know if you get that same sense. So I'm interested in seeing what you kind of think about those post 9/11 excesses and how maybe they're influencing, and maybe not a great way, but also is creating this skepticism that may also be healthy.
No, I think you put your finger on it. It's great. I mean, I think a lot of people feel really burned by Iraq, and some of the things like Bolton would have advocated, we didn't even do, but we'd be even more disastrous position, like starting a war with Iran, for instance. So like we're sort of fortunate we're not even worse given what some of these people were advocating. But yeah, I mean, and at a personal level, there's a friend of mine who, is sort of my age, but he's like, I remember back in 2003, like we just those were our team. That was our part of the coalition that was responsible for foreign policy. So we agreed, so we went along with them. And now it's like, wait, not only did they screw up the foreign policy thing, but they've created enormous backlash against, other parts of this coalition. And I think a lot of people, even some of the more vocal kind of, again, I don't like this term, but isolationists or whatever, restrainer types themselves were advocates for a harder line and now feel disillusioned and kind of feel like, hey, I really, almost like an atonement element, or kind of a balance, and that's what I'm trying, and that's why I when I speak to especially audiences like this, I recoil against the term hawk. And Ross Douthat was an old friend of mine from college, and Ross wrote a piece in the New York Times, and I was very happy he did, because he made the point that I was against the Iraq War at the time. We were like roommates around that period, and we knew each other very well, and that's not to say that I'm infallible, to the contrary, as my wife and kids will tell you, but like, it's more just to say, my view is not like, it's not like I've been just looking for another opponent. I mean, the only war in my adult lifetime that new war that I've supported is the original mission in Afghanistan against Al Qaeda, which of course I still think was the right call, but then we should have taken a much lighter footprint after that. And cut some kind of a deal, but not this sort of whole nation building thing. I was against the Iraq War. I was against the Libya intervention. I've been against the Syria stuff. So it's like, I'm against putting U.S. forces into Ukraine. I mean, certainly like, combat forces. I mean, if there's some ninja stuff that we can do, that's a different story. But that's sort of, I think it's important, because I think of what you're pointing to, which is people are like, these people are all just warmongers. They all get money from Raytheon or, Lockheed or whatever. And there is a lot of truth, not so much the defense industry thing. I tend to think that's exaggerated, but more that like, there's a group of people who just want to find, like normally I'm of the view that politics is about addition, not subtraction. But I remember like a year or two ago, Robert Kagan wrote something about how we need to, defend Taiwan. I was like, hey, I was like on Twitter, I was like, this guy is a big part of why we're in this situation. And we need to actually differentiate ourselves from this kind of view, those of us who are arguing for this, because, he would have us triple the defense budget and get in wars all over the place, and that's not what this is about. So, I think, look, fundamentally, I make an intellectual argument, or not intellectual, political policy argument, which is if China takes over, so it's like, I actually think it's a very kind of new conservative argument, right? Because if you're a Robert Zoellick type, if you think that money just flows across borders and that's how it's going to be, you wouldn't be worried about China taking over Asia, because we'll be able to trade with them. But if you're somebody who, like I think people on the new right do, understand that politics and economics are inseparable, then you understand that the Chinese are definitely going to reshape the world economy in their favor and that's why they're doing this, and that they're going to use that influence. And it's exactly like, if we're afraid of and justifiably afraid of the left canceling us and, using social media to discriminate against us and so forth. Well, at least we have the possibility of electing a majority that we like and changing things. But if the Chinese are in control, then forget it. Like, we don't have that ability. And that's the thing that I'm And I don't trumpet the ideological thing much for a variety of reasons, but like they're not Burkeans, they're really not. They're avowedly Maoists, not like Cultural Revolution necessarily, but that's their intellectual heritage. So I don't think, to me, that just means like we shouldn't give them the benefit of the doubt about what they'll be like when they're in control.
Maybe this is poking the bear a little bit, but on that last point, I mean, what do you make of the argument that you've heard from certain sort of high-profile members of the New Right about more or less China being Burkean, right? I mean, I don't know if I've actually heard that.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Specific term Burkean, but I've seen the argument that they are sort of a traditionalist nation state that's getting back in touch with their sort of ancient traditions, and that therefore they should be, I think the language from the New York Times op-ed was respected as civilizational equals.
Well, I certainly agree that China should be respected as a civilization.
Sure, it's worth differentiating, I guess, from respecting them as civilizational equals and seeing them as an aspirational model that we should try to move the United States further towards.
Yeah, I don't think that comports with reality. I mean, I think there are particular things that the Chinese might have done on, industrial development or currency or whatever that we can learn from. Certainly their military buildup has been impressive. But the notion that they're some kind of national conservative is like belied by the fact that they're avowedly communist. And I mean, like, for instance, they've had enforced abortions for the last couple of generations. And within living memory, they embarked on a cancellation project that makes ours pale in comparison. And they, the the Great Leap Forward killed like tens and tens of millions of people. And, that was a while ago, kind of. I mean, it was in the living memory of my parents. I mean, they were alive at that time. And like the guy who's running the show right now his father was, like one of the red, sort of heroes is probably a little strong, but like, that's what he regards as the legacy, and the way the Chinese talk about it is Mao Zedong got 2/3 right, 1/3 wrong. It's like, well, it's like a big 1/3. So like, I don't, this is not Lee Kuan Yew. And I mean, I have issues with Lee Kuan Yew on here and there, but I think you can have tremendous respect for what Singapore has been able to accomplish, or some of the other, Lee Kuan Yew always described himself as a social democrat, but you could make arguments that are more similar there. But those are governments that always had a strong sense of limits, that is, I think, core to any kind of conservative idea. Doesn't mean, you can't touch the economy. Of course, to the contrary. I mean, that part, I think we could probably learn a lot from, the Asian tigers in terms of our economic model. I mean, that's Michael Lynn's point. And actually that more than that, we could learn from our own history before, say, about 1979, that on that topic. But yeah, it's an interesting, it's actually kind of befuddling, because it's like, and the other thing is, most of the people who really look at what the Chinese are saying emphasize that they are much more Marxist than most people give them credit for. Again, I don't actually play that up a lot, but like, they're historical materialists. Like, I don't, you don't have to be obviously religious to be conservative, but like, I am. And I don't think that I don't want to be under a government that's like actually materialistic and looks at people through essentially solely consequentialist eyes. And I think that's, they don't hide it.
Elbridge, I think we have time for about 2 more questions. I want to do one more on foreign policy before we pivot to a final question on conservatism. So one area that, I think there's a lot of people on the right, even broadly, that would agree with you. But I think one area where you've gotten some pushback is, tactically speaking, like, are we even capable of defending Taiwan? Like, what would that look like? So if you could address that, and then also maybe comment briefly on, there's soft power, there's hard power. In terms of economics, there's a lot of ways that we could maybe push for a more strategic decoupling, but it seems as though a lot of elite financial interest runs counter to that. And so maybe if you could comment on both those 2 things, I'd be interested.
On Taiwan, it's hard, but it's doable. It's very difficult to launch and sustain an amphibious operation, an air assault operation against. I mean, actually, the Russians were just having difficulties with an air assault operation. It looks like in Ukraine, where they have significant local dominance, and they're not separated by a large body of water. But it is feasible. We just need to do it, and we're not. And that just, I mean, we're too slow and not doing it enough. But there are people out there, I mean, who some people don't really know what they're talking about. I mean, military analysis, and I am not a true expert on military analysis, but I know a lot of them, and I know the people who are most credible. And the way they describe it is a very difficult problem that is tractable if we buy the right things and we're properly postured and we've trained correctly, and the Taiwanese and the Japanese are doing the right thing. It is feasible. A lot of it is about having the right munitions, the right submarines and aircraft ready. And that's one of the reasons I'm so worried about these deployments to Europe, is because it's not like those ground forces are that big of a deal. But, no president is realistically going to deploy those ground forces into combat without air and other forms of space, these kinds of forms of support. And those are scarce, unfortunately. Basically, we have a much bigger army than we realistically probably need, and we have a smaller Air Force in particular, as well as Navy, than we need. That's what we've decided to have. That you can't change that over a kind of year on year. I hope we can change it over like a decade plus. But yeah, that's the thing. And look, the proof is in the pudding. Mao Zedong was planning to invade Taiwan in 1949, 1950, and then when the Korean War broke out, Truman stuck the 7th Fleet in there. And the reason they haven't tried is not because they didn't want it. The reason they haven't tried is because they couldn't do it. So they're getting, it's kind of, there's a tendency to be like, oh, it's totally undoable, or Bridge is exaggerating. It's in the middle. We're in a situation where it's a close cut issue, and that's very dangerous, because they could decide that they want to do it, and they could get away with it. And my part of my urgency on it is like, why are we even getting close? Like, why are we even leaving any doubt? I would want to flood the zone so they'd have no doubt in their mind that they're going to get smoked if they try to cross the strait. And then we don't need to poke them in the eye. We don't need to embarrass them about it. But they will understand that they would fail. Second point on this is really interesting. My colleague, Robert Delfeld, is a brilliant guy, has been thinking a lot about this. The sort of, I guess you could say, class would be one, or the sort of interest group basis for a conservative model. I mean, I think, probably the financial industry, it's going to depend. It's a little bit more disaggregated. I mean, clearly the Democrats now are representing the elite. I mean, they don't like to admit it, but it's obvious that they're, in a lot of respects, they're the sort of knowledge elite and the kind of globalists, And so elements of capital that are, and again, I'm not as sophisticated on this, but elements of capital that are more tied to that, maybe like investment banks or something, might be more inclined to that. But I do think there are elements of, you can make it in the interest. I guess the point is, I don't think conservatives should regard the financial services industry as writ large hostile territory, because there are people who are just going to agree with us anyway on principle. And B, I think there are probably structural interests in especially as the kind of decoupling that you suggested happens, as it becomes more difficult to invest in directly in China, there's more risk and so forth. There are going to be other opportunities. So I think it's going to take a more refined analysis than I can provide. Obviously, people with an interest in reshoring, nearshoring, industrial, revivifying our industrial base, those are going to be areas that I think are going to be naturally sympathetic to kind of, I think, what it sounds like we're all, supportive of. But, and then, I mean, if you look at the political fundraising, it suggests there's, a lot of average people are willing to support it. One thing I would say on the foreign policy side about this is, one of the reasons I think our foreign policy elite is so bad is that the founders created a system where foreign policy is really controlled largely by the president. So it's an elite enterprise already. And then and then the support for it, it's very concentrated in Washington, and then that's like where people who are interested in the foreign, this kind of more globalist idea, there's a lot more support for it. Whereas like people who are more interested in the kinds of things that we're talking about here, they might give like, hey, education reform in my state, or, and so there isn't as much, and that, given, okay, that means there are fewer people submitting op-eds to the Wall Street Journal or National Review or the Federalist or whatever, who have more of this kind of view. So that's something like structurally where, that's special pleading because it would benefit me. But I think, one of my views is like, people sometimes are like, well, you're in this like anti-elitist group. And I was like, well, I'm not anti-elite. There's always an elite. There was an elite in like the Khmer Rouge had an elite, but we just want a better elite, and we should be intentional about how we could develop that. That's going to be better for the nation, for everybody, whether they're elite or not.
Elbridge, just to wrap things up, we want to ask you one question we ask all of our guests, and I know you touched on this at the beginning, but if you could put a finer point on it, what do you think conservatism is?
I think conservatism is basically the idea that your priorities should be the things that are closest and kind of natural to you, or like that are closest to you. Obviously natural as well, like the family, your friendships, your country. Obviously you can change your country, you can change your family, but like there are sort of high bars to that, but that's sort of, and it's not bad to favor your own family, country, community over others. Doesn't, I think an enlightened conservatism says, I'm not just going to, like Vladimir Putin style, hurt other people to kind of get our benefit. You look for positive some things, but that's the sort of the value aspect of conservatism. And then the sort of heuristic or viewpoint is one that's sort of more skeptical, or sort of a little more cautious, conservative in the sense like you actually are. Hey, if you're thinking about a conservative risk profile, if you're investing, you don't throw it all on like the roulette table. That's sort of so those are the two, and so to me, like conservatism doesn't define my views. I'm a Christian, right? Like I'm a realist. I think of myself as a liberal in certain respects. A conservative liberal. So, but I think I'm proud to wear the moniker of conservative, but it's not a total identity, and I think that's actually part of being a conservative. Is actually it's not a total identity. Unlike say Marxism or something like that. It's and that's why. One of the features of the rhetoric of the last few years is like, we all have sort of divided identities. That's part of being an American, right? That's part of but that's okay, because you're not being a conservative to say like politics is not going to solve all of your problems, but it is really important to get it right.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Elbridge. If people are interested in seeing more of your work or following you, where can they find you?
Sure. Well, our website is www.themarathoninitiative.org. You can find all my work and media appearances there. And then if you on Twitter at Elbridge Colby.
Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please feel free to head over to isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, ISI books, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.